September 16th, 1920. Downtown Manhattan, New York City, New York. Wall Street, a bustling financial hub of the world's largest economy, spanning 8 blocks and containing the largest stock exchanges and financial companies the world has to offer. What Wall Street wouldn't strike you as is the site of an enduring mystery, a terrorist attack, and an event that would shape the post-World War I America. What happened on this fateful day, and who was responsible for the death of 38 people and the over 300 that were injured? Why has this incident remained a mystery, and who was responsible? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we dive deep into the unsolved and mostly forgotten terrorist attack known as the Wall Street bombing of 1920. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. I am your host, Dominic, and I just want to say I appreciate the support in the past couple days, and if you haven't noticed, I recently announced on my Instagram that I have changed my logo, and along with changing the logo, I will also be doing exclusive cover art for all of the new episodes coming out. You'll be able to find the exclusive cover art on my Instagram. For those of you who view me on Spotify, you will not see that cover art, unfortunately, because Spotify will not let you change individual episode cover art, but YouTube will allow me to do that. So if you are listening on YouTube, you'll be able to see the exclusive cover art, but if you are listening on Spotify, don't worry, it will be posted to my Instagram along with all the pictures that are relevant to each and every episode. Small steps for sure, but they are very big ones in my eyes, and slowly but surely I am doing little things to make the podcast better for everybody and trying to get my name out there a little bit more. So with that being said, let's get into today's episode. So I decided to go down the true crime route for this week, as I thought it had been a little while since I have done something true crime related. I'm sure I did the Kashmir Princess a couple weeks ago, but that was more of kind of government conspiracy cover-up type of story, where this is more of the true crime route. So yeah, this one definitely intrigued me. I was doing my usual digging throughout the internet, trying to find out topics that were kind of done the true crime route that I had not heard of before, and I happened to stumble across this one. And when I found it, I was intrigued for sure, and it was because I had never heard of this before, and realistically, I would think that something on this scale that this attack was, that this would be more well-known or more kind of discussed in the public's eye in terms of major terrorist attacks that took place on U.S. soil. So definitely an interesting one. I shouldn't say I had a lot of fun researching it, but I did. It was very interesting to research and learn about this time period that America was in, and kind of what led up to this event in particular, and like I said, kind of what the world was like during this time period, because it was not a great time for America, and this was kind of one of those events that really kind of shaped the American mindset towards the possibilities of domestic terrorism and so on and so forth. But with that being said, I want to work into this week's episode. Now, like I mentioned, I hadn't even heard about this before, and you would think that a terrorist attack on U.S. soil that took the lives of 38 people, one of which that has never really been solved, and you would think that there would be a guilty party for this, but that is not the case. This case has remained unsolved for over 100 years, with no sole party coming forward and claiming responsibility for it. So, how the layout of today's episode is going to work is that I am first going to explain what happened that day on September 16th, 1920, possible motives and suspects, and this event's connection with another similar series of events that happened a year prior. And then after we get through all that, we will then get into theories. So with that being said, let's get into the Wall Street bombing of 1920. Just barely after lunch on September 16th, 1920, the streets on Wall Street were jam-packed with messenger boys, clerks, bankers, and employees of both the J.P. Morgan & Co. headquarters and across the street at the U.S. Sub-Treasury and Assay Office. These were both at the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street. Little would they know that day that this would be the site of the most deadly terror attack in the U.S. up until the Oklahoma City bombings 75 years after this. Now at 12:01 p.m., a horse-drawn wagon cart parked out front of the J.P. Morgan & Co. building suddenly exploded. Inside the cart was over 100 pounds of dynamite. Now on top of the dynamite was a pile of sash weights and metal slugs. Now if you don't know what sash weights are, sash weights were most commonly used to balance the shades in large Victorian-style windows. Just the more you know, just for context. Now, the sash weights and the metal slugs that were on top of the dynamite acted like shrapnel. Upon the explosion of the wagon, the corner of the street was engulfed in flames. Those next to the cart were pretty much killed instantly, as the pounds of the sash weights and metal fragments cut people into pieces on the street. The blast shattered windows high above both the J.P. Morgan building and the U.S. Sub-Treasury building, causing a hail of shattered glass to rain down on Wall Street. Witness Andrew Dunn, a J.P. Morgan employee, described the explosion as, and I quote, "That was the loudest noise I ever heard in my life." Another witness told the New York Sun newspaper, and I quote, "I saw the explosion, a column of smoke shot up into the air, and then saw people dropping all around me, some of them with their clothing afire." End quote. Now, 30 people were killed immediately by the explosion, whereas 8 later died from injuries. However, there are varying accounts on whether or not there were more victims than this. Over 300 more were injured. Now, the scene at the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street looked comparable to a war zone. Now, almost a minute after the explosion occurred, the stock exchange, just a little ways down the street, closed out of fear of falling glass raining down on the street. As that started to, obviously the windows shattered high above in the buildings, and that glass was raining down, the stock exchange closed, basically for the safety of the patrons inside the building and outside. After the smoke cleared and the bodies of the victims lay on the street, the New York City Police Department descended on the area in a mad dash to figure out who could have been responsible for the attack and if any evidence was left at the crime scene. Now, initially, the police had 2 motives as to why somebody possibly could have gone out of their way to target this section of Wall Street. Initially, police thought that this must have been an assassination attempt on J.P. Morgan Jr. However, this would be impossible, as J.P. Morgan Jr. was in Europe at the time of the bombing. The second possible theory the police originally had was that this was an attempted robbery. An attempted robbery on the Sub-Treasury building across the street from the J.P. Morgan building. Now, the Sub-Treasury building this day was actually moving $900 million in gold bars. However, the Sub-Treasury was not reported to be robbed, and there was no evidence that supports this theory. So that left the New York Police Department with the notion that this must have been a terrorist attack. But from who? Who would have conducted such an attack? To better understand this portion of history and who could have been responsible, I want to give you a short little lesson into the series of bombings that occurred just a year prior to this. Now, in 1919, a series of bombings rocked major U.S. cities across the country on June 2nd of that year. The bombs all detonated within 90 minutes of each other. The targeted cities were Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Philly, and Paterson, New Jersey. All of the bombs were targeted towards politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials. This series of attacks were carried out by a group of U.S.-based anarchists. And now just another little tidbit. Anarchists believe that society should have no laws, police, or authority. Again, just so you know. During this period, a small group of these anarchists believed that the only way to achieve their goals was by violent means. This small group was led by a man by the name of Luigi Gallieni. And if I pronounce that wrong, I do apologize. And they were known as Galenius. Galenius? Galenius. Galenius? I'm going to go with Galenius. Again, if I pronounce that wrong, I do apologize. Now, the Galenius had sent a series of mail bombs in April to only moderate success, so they decided to take a more upfront and more violent approach to get their points across. These bombs sent out on June 2nd were packed with 25 pounds of dynamite each, along with heavy metal slugs, much like the Wall Street bomb in many ways. The most notable of these attacks was one targeted towards the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, in which a Galenist, Carlo Valdinocci, was heading to plant the bomb at the house of Attorney General Palmer when the bomb happened to explode too early, which killed him in the process. Now, it's important to note that Carlo did make it to the Attorney General's house. However, the bomb still exploded early, so the bomb never injured anybody else except for Carlo, because Carlo was killed pretty much instantly by the bomb going off too early. But it did make it to Palmer's house, so that is kind of important context. Now, these attacks by the Galenius didn't kill any of the intended targets in the 1919 series of attacks. However, it did claim the life of a New York City watchman. So the intended targets of the bombs, the Galenius didn't really have much. They didn't have any success in killing their actual intended targets. However, the only target, or I should say collateral damage in this case, was a New York City watchman who happened to find a bomb in New York before it reached its intended destination. Now, inside of these bombs were flyers or pamphlets which read the following, and I quote, "War, class war, and you were the first to wage it under the cover of the powerful institutions you call order. In the darkness of your laws, there will have to be bloodshed. We will not dodge. There will have to be murder. We will kill because it is necessary. There will have to be destruction. We will destroy to rid the world of your tyrannical institutions." End quote. Now, that's not a very friendly message to put inside of a bomb by any means. And it's important to note that this time in America was a turbulent one. On top of the attacks by anarchists, the country was also in the middle of the flu pandemic. The Russian Civil War was going on, aka the Bolshevik Revolution. So that was raising tensions in America, as obviously the Russian government being switched over, that was kind of stressful in America. And even during this time, there were violent labor strikes that were taking place across the country. So it was a very difficult time for Americans, and the attacks by anarchists really just added fuel to the fire of what a lot of Americans were going through on a daily basis. And the Americans wanted answers for the violent attacks by anarchists, and what followed up were a series of raids by the U.S. government to try and arrest and round up suspected anarchists. This became known as the Palmer Raids, named after Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Now, these Palmer Raids were mildly successful, and it made then FBI, or the precursor to the FBI, Director J. Edgar Hoover. If you know anything about American history, you probably have heard of the name J. Edgar Hoover. Now, it made then Director of the Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, look silly in some regards, because they conducted all these raids to round up suspected anarchists, and even illegal immigrants, and deport them back to their home countries. But this was only mildly successful. However, the Bureau of Investigation, and then later the FBI, did learn some valuable information for later domestic terrorist incidents from this, so it wasn't a complete failure. Now, the Galenius never claimed responsibility for the 1919 bombings, but in many ways, these attacks were complete failures too. These bombs didn't kill any of their intended targets, like I mentioned before, and in many ways, their organizational skills when coordinating these attacks was spotty at best. Previous attacks in 1916 and 1917 had more success than those that took place in 1919, when the Galenius planted a bomb at a parade in San Francisco, which killed 10, and that was in 1916. And then they later placed a bomb inside of a Milwaukee police station that also killed 10 people in 1917. So the anarchists had a couple years of a track record of doing this, so it wasn't unheard of wasn't a shock to think that they could pull off something of this magnitude. However, we will get into that a little bit more later. And with all of that took place in 1916, 1917, and then the series of bombings in 1919, That brings us back to September of 1920. Now, with the Galanius only having mild success the year prior in getting their point across, would it sound reasonable that they would go out of their way to plan an attack of this magnitude to induce possibly the greatest number of casualties to get the American public to truly be frightened by their cause? Or maybe perhaps this was a form of retaliation. Possibly, however, the attacks in 1919 makes me kind of curious if this was the case. The 1919 attacks were targeted towards politicians, justice officials, newspaper editors, and high-level businessmen. The 1920 bombing, on the other hand, even though being outside of the J.P. Morgan and Co. building, seemed to be targeting the public on the street, and that there really wasn't any extra motivation behind this rather than just killing people. And I could be wrong, and maybe the Galanius thought that killing large numbers of people, whether they be newspaper editors or high-level politicians, didn't matter in the end because all they had to do was kill people, and people would, or more importantly, the government would better understand their cause. Obviously, it's important to note that not all anarchists are violent. It was just this specific group of anarchists, the Galanius, which were particularly violent, as they felt like this was the only way to get their means across, and that they could get their point across of no government, no laws, and so on and so forth. Now, with them planting the bomb outside of the J.P. Morgan and Co. building in the horse cart, it makes me curious. If the Galanius had a way to get it inside of the J.P. Morgan and Co. building, would they? Or did they physically just have no way of getting the bomb inside of the building because it was just so large and they just wouldn't be able to do it? That's reasonable to think that. However, I think the bomb on 1920 killed more paperboys and people on the street than prominent businessmen who were the targets of their previous attacks. But perhaps that's what the attackers were going for, like I mentioned. However, there is more evidence, as you kind of start to think to yourself, oh, well, there's not anything else, like any other parties that could do this. Maybe it was another group, or maybe it was a Galanius. There is more evidence that links the Galanius to the bombing. The day of the bombing, postal workers discovered advertising flyers that were mailed between 11:30 a.m. that morning and 11:58. And they read the following. And this was September 16th, 1920, the day of the bombing. Postal workers found these advertising flyers. And the advertising flyers read the following. And I quote, "Remember, we will not tolerate any longer. Free the political prisoners, or it will be sure death for all of you. American anarchist fighters." Now, and that's an end quote. Now, I don't know what political prisoners they're referencing here. In the articles I read, I couldn't find anything about political prisoners, so I'm not sure if the United States had political prisoners that were of some interest to the Galanius or the anarchists, for that matter. I couldn't really find that out. However, what I could find is that the attack is further believed that this could have been retaliation, like I mentioned previously, for a murder indictment of two followers of Luigi Gallieni in Dedham, Massachusetts, just 2 days prior. Now, these two followers of Luigi were convicted, murder conviction, and that researchers speculate that this could be retaliation for that. However, that remains to be seen. There's no real evidence that supports that. Obviously, the advertising flyers don't say that this is a retaliation for that. They are strictly just saying, free the political prisoners. Could that be the two followers that they're referencing? I'm not sure. Like I said, couldn't find out who the political prisoners were that they were referencing in the advertising flyers. And I couldn't figure out whether or not that this was surefire retaliation from the Gallienists for the murder indictment of two Gallienists in Massachusetts a couple days prior. So, who was responsible for this attack? And that brings us into the theories section. And hopefully I kind of wrapped everything up very quickly. Obviously, this is it's unsolved, but it's kind of short and sweet and to the point of who could have possibly done this. However, you might be thinking that there's only one culprit. However, I decided to go a little bit outside of the box and kind of connect the dots in terms of what I think could be another group that was responsible for this. Now, with the theories, I have two theories. Now, my first theory is the second group that I think could be responsible for this, and wait for it, the government. Now, the first theory, the government. Why do I say the government as a possible theory for this? Now, to start this off, I have a theory that's a little bit more out there. Like I said, this is the whole government idea. And just hear me out for a second. Attorney General Palmer and J. Edgar Hoover, during the time period of the first bombings in 1919, wanted to put a stop to the anarchist movement in America. And with the Palmer raids falling flat and perhaps not the outcome that they were looking for at all, when it came to rounding up and deporting many of these anarchists and even illegal immigrants, and with the Gallianists not taking responsibility for any of the bombings in the eyes of the American public, maybe the government needed a reason to deport any enemies of the state that they thought were a threat to national security, and maybe they planted the bomb themselves to provide motivation for the American people to get behind deporting and arresting a majority of these anarchists. Now, it's important to note during this time period, Americans were for basically getting rid of these anarchists and getting rid of the illegal immigrants in the country to a certain degree. A lot of them felt like, obviously, the violent ones needed to be gone. However, there wasn't enough evidence to substantiate getting rid of all of them by just saying, like, oh, all of them are dangerous. The American people were kind of like, well, I guess that's not really true, because you don't know whether or not this person is going to commit a crime. And the American government's like, no, we still got to deport them all, and we still got to arrest them all. And the American public's like, well, they're just people. We don't know if they're going to commit a crime. So it was very difficult for the U.S. government to pretty much say, hey, let's get rid of them all. So maybe this was their idea. They're not ingenious, because it's not, idea to maybe get the American public behind deporting a lot of these anarchists, these illegal immigrants that they felt like were going to come into America and compromise American U.S. democracy and cause terror in the eyes of the public. Even though there was no evidence that was going to show that all of these illegal immigrants were going to do that, they felt like the best way to rid the country of anything that threatened American democracy was to just get rid of them all. So this gets to the point where the U.S. government designed the bomb much like how the Gallianists did theirs back in 1919, just extremely larger in scale to lead the public down this direction that the Gallianists were responsible. And then the Gallianists would not take responsibility for this act because they physically didn't commit it. They physically didn't do it. And that explains the reason for why nobody came forward and claimed responsibility, is that this wasn't the Gallianists. This was the U.S. government probably providing a reason to kick the anarchists, the Gallianists, out of the country, or even get them arrested. Now, that might be a little bit of a stretch, but it's very interesting to think about. And with that being said, that leads us to our second theory, and our second theory being anarchists. This theory is obviously the most likely and the most believed theory, and honestly, it's the least fun theory, in my opinion. But this is just that this was the Gallianists who did this after the minor success they had the year prior. Obviously, they didn't like the U.S. government's push to get the anarchists rounded up and arrested, or even deported, so they responded with a bomb that would cause maximum carnage and maximum destruction. They would hope that this caused enough chaos so that America would be in fear and maybe view the anarchists as a more significant threat to American democracy. And those are my two theories. And now again, this attack remains unsolved because nobody came forward and claimed responsibility for these attacks. So it is very possible that we will never know who committed this crime or why they did it. However, as unsolved as this is, it's fun to think about conspiracy and cover up, but I think at the end of the day, this was the Gallianists. And even though that answer is very plain and very boring, there is just too much evidence that paints the damning picture for those responsible, and that perhaps no other group in the country at this point in history would have more to gain from a large-scale attack such as this one. Obviously, the Gallienists had their means about them. They had planted numerous bombs before, to obviously moderate success, obviously in 1916 and 1917, and then obviously kind of falling flat on their face in 1919. So could they have just responded with their magnum opus, per se, of, all right, let's plant a gigantic bomb in possibly the most busiest area we could find that will stick it to the corporations and stick it to the U.S. government? Is that the possibility? I strongly believe so. Even though I feel like the U.S. government is a good theory that I kind of came up with, I don't think there's enough there to really strongly consider that the U.S. government was responsible. And like I said, I just don't think any organization during the United States at this time would have the motivation or the means to do something like this, like the Gallienists and the anarchists did. But with that being said, that is going to conclude today's episode on the Wall Street bombing of 1920. Now, a little shorter episode compared to weeks prior. Obviously, I've been very busy with designing a new logo, getting new cover art straightened away, and eventually working on new intro music. So I've had my plate full a little bit the past couple days. However, I do hope you appreciated this episode. Maybe a little plain in terms of what the end result probably is. However, it's still a very compelling true crime case that is over 100 years old and still remains unsolved. Could you kind of take this all up and assume that this was the Gallienists, tie it up, put it on a bow, set it on a shelf somewhere, and say, okay, case closed? You probably could. However, it is one of those things where, as such of a large-scale terrorist attack as this was at the time, it was very significant in U.S. history, and the fact that it is not talked about more is very shocking to me and very surprising. But with that being said, that is going to conclude today's episode on the Wall Street bombing of 1920. I'm going to do my obligatory plugs like I do every week. If you are listening on Spotify, please turn your notifications on. You will get notified every time I post a new episode. And if you are listening on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. You will also get notified every time I post a new episode, and it helps me out a lot. And if you don't know, you can go on my Instagram. I will be posting pictures that are relevant to the episode every single week. As well with those pictures will be the cover art for all of my episodes now. So not only do you get to see the pictures relevant to the episode, you get to see the unique cover art for every episode that I do, and that will be on my Instagram. That is Unblurring the Unknown on Instagram. And if you want to do me a big favor and send me some topic suggestions, you're more than welcome to do that. You can send them to my email, and that is unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. I will say that again, unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Obviously, gonna try and continue to change it up for you guys every single week. Maybe one week it'll be a cryptid, maybe one week it'll be aliens, maybe one week it'll be true crime, maybe it'll be an unsolved disappearance, or so on and so forth. I'm gonna try to continue to switch it up week after week. And I hope you all are enjoying the content I am making. If you want to see something different from me, or if you want me to report on more true crime or more cryptids or so on and so forth, leave a suggestion in the comments. You're more than welcome to do that. Again, all of your interaction helps me out a lot. I greatly appreciate it, and I appreciate all the support. But with that being said, I will see you all on the next one.